Hey, welcome to the PM Mastermind, a community for PMs to get advice, share advice, and build relationships. Thank you for joining another session of this podcast. Today, we're super excited. We're going to be talking about creating and managing successful 0 to 1 products as a PM. We have an amazing guest with us, Ayuba. We'll introduce him shortly. But just to get the format stuff out of the way, we're going to start with some initial questions. And then we will go to questions from our community of over 12,000 product professionals helping each other learn and grow. And we'll end with a fun rapid fire round. Before we get started, we'll do some quick intros. My name is Felix, and I'm a product manager at Google. I've been a product manager at Google for about 2 years now. Total time in PM is about 5 years. And I started this community and this podcast because when I first started, it was incredibly difficult being a PM. And I didn't get much better at it until I started connecting with other PMs, sharing challenges, sharing what worked, what didn't work, best practices. And I wanted to help other PMs do the same. And so this community has been a phenomenal opportunity to help other PMs meet, connect, learn, and grow. And I'm grateful to have connected with Akshay and Jayanth here, who are going to do their intros next. Let's start with you, Akshay.
Thank you, Felix. So I'm Akshaya. I'm a PM at Wish, and I currently work on ML solutions for the supply side of the marketplace. My background is that I'm a hardware engineer turned product manager, and very similar to Felix's story, I love connecting with others and kind of networking with different PMs to really understand more about the core craft of product. And that's how I kind of came into contact with this community and with both Giant and Felix. And I wanted to join them in being able to help others kind of go through their product career as well. And yeah, so that's a little bit about me. I'll pass it on to Giant.
Hey guys, I'm Janth, product manager at Capital One. Been a product manager for about 5 years now, and similar to Felix and Akshaya, I really leveled up and grew in my career by learning from product managers around me and learning more about the craft and some of the skills and secret hacks that they had. And the PM Mastermind community has been instrumental for my personal growth as a product manager. So love being able to contribute and help out to help other product managers around me grow in their careers and hopefully learn a couple things from them as well. I'll hand it back to Felix to introduce our guest speaker.
Yes, we are very honored to have Ayuba Audu. And Ayuba is currently a product manager at Coda, supporting the team that empowers customers to work with their data in Coda and the underlying data model that supports their imagination. Previous to Coda, Ayuba spent a decade at Microsoft building products from 0 to 1 all the way through to the scaled stages. We are super honored to have you here, Ayuba. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Now, I would have to say that personally, I consider Ayuba to be one of my mentors, and I feel very fortunate to have crossed paths with him. So I'm super excited to dive in. As we said, 10 years at Microsoft, building 0 to 1. I mean, I think, and now at a much smaller startup kind of situation. So I think we have a lot to learn. So let's go ahead and dive in. Just to kind of let you know how this conversation is going to go, we've sort of broken the conversation up into strategy and vision, market and user understanding,
Okay.
and then execution. And then we'll close again, as I mentioned, questions from the community and our lightning round. So with that, I'll let Akshaya kick off our strategy and vision segment.
Yes. Thank you, Ayuba, once again for joining us. So yes, from a product strategy and vision perspective, let's start with like the most basic question here. How do you define a 0 to 1 effort?
Sure. And by the way, just Felix and everyone, I think this community is fantastic. And I think peer mentorship in general, learning from others, is probably one of the most underrated things in the product discipline. And so glad that you and the team are doing this and just happy to support in any way I can. Now, I think back to the question, I think partially I'd say it's subjective and there could be various ways you could describe this. But for me, I like to think of it through, if people are familiar, like Ken Beck's framework about like explore, expand, and extract. And really in that explore stage, things are more risky. You're not really sure like if things are going to really have a return on investment, so on and so forth. As you kind of get into expand, things are growing pretty rapidly. You might hear the words hypergrowth, sometimes associated with this. And then finally, like extract stage where, you generally understand the space, you generally understand the solutions. And at this point, it's really just about economies of scale, running different playbooks and taking advantage. And so generally to me, like a 0 to 1 effort really just sits in that like explore stage to potentially like early expand. We're still doing a lot more experimentation and we're just trying to understand like, is there a there, as they say.
Yeah, love that explanation, and we'll definitely try to link to the framework that you just mentioned from Ken Beck. That sounds something super interesting, and I'll definitely learn more from it. Our
Yeah.
next question is like, could you walk us through an example of like your experiences, um, working on a 0 to 1 product in the past, and
Mhm.
just curious to hear about the strategic considerations you had of why you chose to move forward with that specific product. I'm sure there's a lot of ideas that get eliminated, right? So why did that product go from idea to product?
Yeah. And so some caveats in there. This example I'm sharing is more like in context, I would say, like a larger company. I would also say it wasn't my decision necessarily, but some other things in the organization. But I would share some observations in there that I think are relevant. So for this particular one, I was working on effectively an app that built apps as an incubation. And some of the observations around the time that came to be were one, within the larger context of like the industry and company, we're starting to see like new devices come into market, especially devices that leverage a lot of like touch and what we'd call natural user interface. So whether I could use ink, whether I could touch, something, zoom, pinch with my finger, use voice, for example. Some of those things, we're starting to see more and more of those devices. And so that was kind of one thing going on. I think the next thing that was going on in the market was as we kind of looked at IT in general and just like the various solution organizations with different companies. There was this research, I forget where the company did it, but effectively the backlog for IT at the time was estimated to be about 7 years behind. So this is some IT department is supporting some company building purpose specific apps. There is a backlog of like known ideas that the company would need for various functions, everything from executive assistants, potentially salespeople, so on and so forth. And that backlog was effectively like 7 years deep because they just couldn't keep up with demand. So that's kind of another observation there. Third observation was really around domain experts. Really, at the end of the day, sometimes you might hear them referred to as citizen developers, effectively existing within the company. So this is people in various disciplines. Again, it could be products, it could be marketing, it could be data science, could be security, so on and so forth. Typically, have deep knowledge about the space and the problem. They might even be able to even sketch out like, I think it's kind of this thing I need to solve the solution. And so they're very familiar, with what is required to solve the problem. But then they would argue, I don't know how to code. And so you sort of like look at all those things, kind of new devices, new experiences coming, this IT backlog that we're stuck with. Yet you have people who are expertise. You start thinking about, okay, how do we bring those two things together and create some opportunity and solution in there? And kind of one thing you think about is in general, when you think about apps, you could boil them down and say like, well, they're just screens and business logic, right? So if you look at metaphors in the real world today, if you think about like, any slide based software, because a bunch of slides, you could argue is a bunch of screen. If you look at any spreadsheet type software, there's a bunch of business logic in there. You'll say if this then blah blah blah, if this then color this, right? And so people are familiar with those models, but they would never consider themselves coders. And so we started to bring those, concepts together of like, if we could enable people with some, platform where they could go to and say, hey, those metaphors you know about a screen, those metaphors you understand about business logic, but also your domain knowledge, if we can give you a canvas to actually express those things, you could start to head towards people being able to build applications. And so that's sort of the space that it investigated in of like, could we use that as a way to also, by the way, drive kind of more revenue in terms of like more sales for devices, more people building apps for the ecosystem at the time that I was part of in there, and then also actually like enable customers themselves to start not just building apps for themselves, but sort of creating space for like higher leverage opportunities where the things now your software engineers are spending time on or the developers or consultants you might hire in the company are much more like high leverage projects versus the let's build, the PC refresh app or something else where like somebody who's running that department, given the right tools, could go enable that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
phenomenal.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you for sharing those insights. I think it's really interesting. 0 to 1, as you mentioned, especially with that like explore phase. I think a
Mhm.
lot of times people think like, oh, we're building some like, I don't know, the new social media app or something like that. But a lot of times, it's
Mhm.
not always that, right? It's just something that doesn't exist currently, a functionality, a capability, and you're really just trying to figure out like, okay, what's the product market fit? So I love that. For our next question, some of our listeners, given that framework, some of our listeners might be thinking now, maybe I'm working on a 0 to 1. I'm building some new feature from scratch. It hasn't been in the product yet. I'm not iterating on an existing one, right? But, I'm curious, what
Yeah.
advice would you have for them, like kind of as they're thinking strategically about this? And does the advice change based on the stage of the company. So if someone's at a large company, like you were just giving that example, versus at a smaller company, does your general advice for working on 0 to 1 change at all? And what is that advice?
Yeah, I would say it changes, and famous PM thing, it depends. And so, I think overall, like context is really important. And so, the funny thing with Ken's framework, if you think about it, is that whole explore, expand, extract. Even within those stages, Kent describes it as like it's fractal. So even within those stages, you can also be doing exploring, expanding, and extracting in there. And so that's something to keep in mind. But in general, I think the thing to kind of think about is one way you could talk about it is this idea of as the company grows and as the idea grows, the behaviors that are involved in terms of how people maximize value changes. And so when you're in Explore, some of the things you're really like trying to do is like, how do you, overcome disinterest? How do you try different experiments? How do you kind of get buy-in and just kind of get going? As you start getting into Expand, some of the concerns around there are just like, now you're scaling really quickly. There are a bunch of bottlenecks. There are a bunch of things where, oh, like you're growing this fast. Well, we never budgeted this many servers, or we've never had this many ops people, or we've never had to handle this much incoming volume. Like a couple of things in there, start thinking about that may not be common. But as you get into extract, now you're at scale. You want to sustain growth. You want to show Wall Street things are continuing to improve. So how do you start increasing profitability, right? So you start thinking about things like, well, the user base might not be growing necessarily as it used to be growing before. You start thinking about companies that have like 3 billion users, for example. Like, where'd you go find the next billion in there? It becomes an interesting question. But you could start to think about like with the existing users we have, if they're still finding value, are there ways for us to actually increase the revenue we're making per user? And so those become concerns you start to think about. And so I think overall, like as you kind of evaluate, you want to like ground yourself in like what stage you're in first, and then start to think about, okay, what concerns in that area, and then you start to adjust in terms of like, okay, what behaviors do we have? In Explore, you might be doing things that don't conform to the standard, like OKR process or anything else in your organization, and it's not even right to start judging the progress in there. But as you start to get into expand and extract, then you start to more formalize some of these things, start to streamline into potentially more quantitative things beyond just qualitative, like inputs and outputs that you would have done. But all of those kind of get grounded back again in like kind of what stage are you in, and then kind of looking to the business. The other thing I'll just throw in there is you probably want to also consider, are you like a business to business type solution you're going after? Is it a business to consumer? Because some of those things advise you on like the audience, right? And so in the business to business, you start thinking about, okay, there's probably IT that I need approvals from. They're probably the buyers and people doing tool evaluation who may never use this tool, but are doing the evaluation for like a whole organization. They also might be somebody in your organization who just swipes a credit card and decides to try this thing out. And so all those people now become like your stakeholders, versus sometimes in consumer where like it's literally just you one-to-one with the consumers, which has interesting benefits and trade-offs. Sometimes you get lucky in B2B and enterprise where like there are people you can go to the IT admin and say, okay, we're about to deploy this in your organization. Like, let's work with you to make sure it's successful. So you get some leverage there, but again, more people to talk to. Whereas the consumer, you'll know pretty quickly as well what's working and what's not, because they either use it or not. So it's just some considerations in there, but all of it I kind of ground back in that framework.
I love that. Just to add in before we go to the next section, it really resonated with me when you said about context, because I know, I'm in a growth role right now, and I do a lot of 0 to 1 things, a lot of new features. Exploration I'm constantly in that phase, but I've had to get used to people asking the ROI question. It's like, oh, what's the ROI? And I'm like, we're doing an experiment. Like, we're doing this thing to learn, okay, I can document some hypotheses on ROI, but like my focus for this experiment is not going to be proving positive ROI. We'll never learn anything if we focus on that. Right. So I think that's really important as you're thinking about these different stages and how you create that context and buy-in based on that context. Okay. I'll pass it off to Akshaya to go through the market research section.
Yeah, no worries. So switching gears to market research and user understanding. So when it comes to 0 to 1 products, oftentimes you're working with kind of like zero amount of information, or you're starting from scratch. So what methods do you recommend when it comes to actually looking into who our users are, understanding their needs when it comes to a problem of this sort?
Yeah. Couple of principles maybe in that area that I would say I found generally guide me. And so one, I'm always biasing for just whatever maximizes learning velocity. Kind of back to what Felix was sharing earlier. Like I think Shreyas Doshi has this concept of like certainty theater. And so there's just certain things in organizations or in whatever group you just can't be certain about. And so I think one kind of sitting with that feeling, but also kind of on the other side, really thinking about what are things that can just increase how fast we're learning, like whatever it takes, being scrappy, so on and so forth. I think the next thing I try to think about is, there's a spectrum of various ways you can learn and artifacts you can create. I typically like to think of this as like, how do you start lo-fi and then like refine to hi-fi? And so sometimes you'll hear people talk about, oh, I want to do this thing, but then, I may not have a design partner to work with, or, I don't know how to do this or do that, or I don't know how to code. And just thinking about, what's the lowest fidelity version of this thing you could get out that you're trying to prove. And that's not to say that that's the only thing you should do, but it's a quick way again to, like, as you think about velocity, can I even start something low fidelity, then move over to high fidelity and kind of keep refining based on that, right? And accounting for some of those things. Um, some of the other two I think about are really around like what rituals can you create? And so this is the idea of like, what is something that sometimes, it becomes a pattern, not always, but in general, like trying to think about like, could I make this thing something that I can repeat? And so some examples of this we've done are like ideas around, hey, let's ensure that like with the group of customers we're working with, we have a meeting every Friday. And the next question you might be thinking is, but what if you don't have something to show? And you ask yourself this question of like, well, how might the opposite be true? Because it forces this learning velocity and forces you to continue asking, okay, what's the next step, and how do you keep forcing that conversation? And so generally thinking about that again, not always just guiding principle. And then one other one I try to think about is just like, which ways can you like slipstream into other workflows? And so sometimes, especially if you're in either a larger organization or even trends in the industry, right? So sometimes you find companies will generally be doing research in certain areas, and you can start to figure out, hey, this is not quite exactly the thing you're doing, but it's sort of kind of in the space. And so could I partner with a researcher on that team, or could I partner with some of the product people and engineers or whomever on that team to kind of fund something? Could even be marketing, for example. They're about to go do some audience testing. How can you kind of sneak into that flow and potentially add a few questions and get something there? All the way through on the other end, you could say, hey, I know Stack Overflow every year, they do a developer survey. Is there a way for me to piggyback on that? Because there's something around developer tooling I'm going to go build. And a couple of these other like language stats surveys that you could go plug into. So that's something else generally try to think about. And kind of maybe the final idea I just like to keep in my mind is this concept of, you know, generally it's my position that the number of problems in the world is exponentially larger than the number of unique problems in the world, and which is a bit larger than the number of tools in the world. And so you kind of take that observation and basically just say, in general, I assume generally like most problems, there's probably some like general or global solution in there. And so I always start from like that default position and then kind of refine down and refine down. Okay, what if I look at it differently? What if I look at it a different frame? Are there things I can glean from this? Again, it's not perfect match always. And if not, then generally what tends to signal to me is kind of this litmus test of like, it's probably a more unique problem. It's probably the charter anyway of the thing we're going to do. And so that's kind of good validation for the reason for the case I'm making, or the business or the team existing. But if not, then like it's likely that this problem has been solved somewhere in some variation before. I'll say like date time and time zones handling in general, I argue, is like one of the most central global problems we all have to solve. And I'd argue there are lots of really good open source libraries you could leverage. And so I would just say like, if I was doing anything related with like time and time zones, everything from trying to build a new, consumer calendar that's like task focused and, focuses on a day by day basis or something like that, or something about like, how do I help people better organize tasks across different time zones? Anything that kind of touches that area, that's one of the first things I'm going to look at. Is like, we got to solve time related problems. This feels like a global problem. Let me like test my hypothesis and see, yeah, it's a global problem. Okay, there are a couple of libraries. Let's kind of take that and kind of fold in that knowledge. And if it's unique and truly unique, great. Starting to leverage things like, hey, what are the tools in the market I could use? What are the forums for other competitive products potentially I could go look at and see what's going on there? Social, Google Trends is awesome. Put a trends alert for like the various keywords, get alerts coming to you any day. Analyst reports is another place I've gone to look. So Gartner, for example, Forrester, a couple of these organizations that hire people to basically go study the space and kind of decide who are the leaders, who are the innovators, who are the followers, so on and so forth. That kind of gives you language to think about it, people to look at, so on and so forth. And then the final one I'll just share is like, sometimes it's just very practical, both lived experience, but also like the question of like, hey, Felix, like what are all your tabs at 9 a.m. in the morning, right? Maybe you're doing some type of productivity software. Literally just get on and just like, what does your calendar look like? What does your screen look like? And just start to see like, what are the patterns there in terms of like what people are doing, or, hey, is it easy to share a photo from your phone? Oh yeah, it's very easy. Just walk me through how you do that. And you'll just start to see things that people might not even realize they're doing. So a couple of principles there and a couple of specifics in there that I've tried to apply.
Yeah, Ayuba, I loved your answer, and you gave me flashbacks to when I used to be a software engineer, and I actually had to do stuff against time zones. and it was not a fun experience. Let me put it that way. I also love like what you were saying earlier about, the number of problems that are there in the world to solve is almost infinite, right? And then part of our job is to figure out which one of those are worth solving at the end of the day. And you kind of answered this already a little bit in your previous answer, but how do you actually go from that net set of, okay, I'm seeing, these 50 or 100 problems when I'm doing a user interview or I'm talking to customers, to prioritizing one out of those 50, right? Like, what's your process of assessing that feasibility?
It's like the golden PM question, right? Just put that in a bot, and then we wouldn't have to work so hard. um, no, I think some approaches I've tried in there for myself and on teams I've been on are one. I was hitting on this a little bit, but I think observing the unsaid, and so I think a lot of times there are things it's the human nature test. I don't know if you've ever seen those examples where they'll have a piece of prose or writing and they'll omit a bunch of words and people can still read everything. And so I think about that just as a metaphor for like the amount of things like we face in society or face today that are challenged and we don't even know they're challenges. And so I think it's this general idea of like, how do you observe the unsaid and just continue to create opportunities for yourself? Again, increasing your learning velocity, observing people for the things they're not saying, and starting to understand, well, they might have told me it's about this thing, but as I observe them and see the things they bounce through, hear things like they're not even saying, which could also uncover some insights and what might be good leverage opportunities. The second thing I try to keep in mind is this conversation around how challenging or difficult or something is a problem, but also how important is it? And the fun game in here is like, there are variations of this. I think the $100 test is like one variation of the same idea of if you share a bunch of examples with people of things they said there are problems and then force them to, contribute money to actually fund things, natural separation starts to emerge, right? Where you start to find out, yeah, there might be this thing people say a lot as an issue, but if you ask them how important it was, they might not, care that it's important. Might yell loudly about it, but they might feel, hey, the workaround they have or whatever approach they have is more than enough. And so that's another input signal as well to kind of just decide like, yes, this might be the thing that everybody talks about a lot. There might be a little bit of recency bias in there, but by and large, most people are like happy with the approaches today. It's not that many steps. And also the other thing to think about is like differentiation. If I was to go solve a problem in there, it sounds like that solution, if it disappeared tomorrow, most people wouldn't miss it either. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I think the third thing I just try to keep in mind is then that back to like the lived experience. I think nothing really beats as you're working through this idea and playing with it, really ensuring that you have a tight loop with people that eventually could be your future customers. A lot of times there are various biases and tensions around, people want to say, nice things, or people not even sure that like the thing they're talking about is the problem. But if you ask them a question about the thing, they'll just tell you that's the problem. And so I think really being present and really being observant and ensuring like we're not doing this in a vacuum. There is a tight loop where we can observe people both quantitatively, so whether that's through data, telemetry, or insights, qualitatively, whether that's on video, not on video, unmoderated sessions, moderated sessions, a couple of ways. But understanding like you're getting in the heads and in the mindsets of those people. Sometimes I've even recommended if you could, say you're building something for baristas, right, at Starbucks or whatever, find a way to be a barista for a couple of days and ensure that like you're living through that start to help you judge like, okay, it might sound like this thing is kind of where the heat is or the pain is, but there's this other thing that's much more high leverage in the back that is potentially even non-obvious to a lot of people. Again, the thing that is unsaid, the thing that once you help surface it might not become the thing that's really important, which kind of helps you then switch to this other thing of like how feasible is it, and you kind of start evaluating some of those things from there.
I love that, and especially the bit about the $100 test. That's one of my favorite techniques. So we're definitely going to make sure we link some kind of article or reference for that in the notes. That's a really good one.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about the importance of sort of understanding like user psychology, user behavior, even when you're doing like research, right, and understanding like the answers you're getting, it may not be
Yeah.
super trustworthy, right, or even
Yeah.
about the $100 bill test to try to drill down on what is the real problem, what's the most
Mhm.
important problem, most pressing problem. Can you think of any like more like maybe specific examples where a user said one thing or they said something was a problem but it didn't actually turn out to be that serious, or anything of that kind of sort?
Yeah, I think one that was funny was as we were working, again, previous project I shared earlier about this app that builds apps. especially like geared towards obviously keyboard and mouse scenarios, but also people using touch devices. Um, there was a lot of feedback around the interaction and people sharing feedback about like, hey, how do we make this better on touch? How do we provide? They're like, okay, we want more menus that we could see and like right click and do things. And so we did a lot of work to ensure that basically every like you put a button on a screen, the screen itself, all these things are things like you right click on, there's a menu, just like interesting like UX challenges of if I had 100 buttons on the screen, how do I start to like show and hide some of these things? What's the logic? So it spent a bunch of work trying to make sure that worked out really well. And kind of funny story, the first beta version that kind of came out. Maybe quick poll. What do we think was the thing like most people raised that was a really hard interaction challenge?
I bet it was that right click. It was have something to do with that right click or those interactions?
No, so it wasn't the right click. The funny thing, it was people were trying to delete the controls, so like the buttons and some of these things. And very specifically, the interaction that completely messed was selecting on an item. So I just click a button or I tap on a button, and they would just hit the delete key, and they expected that to work. And that was actually the thing. Even though there was a right click menu, even though there was an undo, even though there were a bunch of these options we'd work through, and it was like, that's the one, that's the one. And like, yeah. In the end, primarily we saw way more people almost thinking honestly like they couldn't do this, and then some people would resort to the extreme where they would basically like delete a screen to delete all the controls, make a new screen, and add a bunch of controls when they made a mistake. And it was just funny watching all the forums blow up and like, I can't delete, and watching us from the other end looking at the screen going, what, like we worked through this. I mean, we saw people do this thing. And so again, back to like things you hear people say and sometimes do, but I think with a little bit more observation, we may have noticed that a little bit more, maybe more telemetry too around like what were the keyboard interactions people were doing. Like, oh, in general, like people either will say they know about these things or may know about these things, but the primary interaction was like they would just select the thing, hit the delete key, and when that doesn't work, they would give up. And so I thought I always just kind of remember that just building for humans is always interesting, and just like always having the humility at the end of the day, like you could do all these things and still miss things. And so again, back to like how do we ensure like there was a channel we could hear this and then learn from it and kind of push that forward.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting anecdote that you've had. I've also had like similar experiences in user studies where um, a user's revealed preference is very different from their stated preference. And I actually came
Mm-hmm.
across like a podcast maybe 1 or 2 months ago where Kevin Systrom, who's one of the co-founders of Instagram, was talking about this, where
Yeah.
he was getting a lot of feedback at the time because Facebook had an algorithmic feed, but Instagram was very against having an algorithmic feed. And he talked about, hey, we listened to that feedback so much that we didn't even want to do like an A/B test to see if algorithmic feeds were better. And they eventually got pushed into doing it because Facebook has great experimentation tools. And what they found
Mm.
was that the revealed preference to having an algorithmic feed was so high that like the statistical significance of it was like off the charts. Like it basically the results from the test was there is 0 point. Actually, sorry, they had to stop the test halfway through because it was already so statistically significant that it did not make sense to even continue the test. Um, so again, like when you're doing user studies, like it's really, really important to listen to what people say and why they say it. But it's also very important to try to get some sort of quantitative data to understand what they're doing and actually trying to understand their lived experiences because you could learn very different things.
Yeah, I remember that story. I would even add, you also remind me of so our chief product officer here at Coda, Lane. He had this story he shares about when you're trying to figure out some of this ambiguity as well. Some of the advice he got around quickly testing the extremes was another approach, so that you start to understand. I think the algorithmic versus chronological is like a good example of this. Of like, all right, let's even just test the extremes and kind of see where that lies. Like we can debate, and sometimes yes, spend some time debating, thinking through some of these things, and kind of building what mental models or things you want to have. But also sometimes too, there's like value in just testing some of these extremes, kind of seeing where you land and kind of what you learn from each of those. And sometimes you just learn, okay, like the thing works, like, okay, now let's maybe make the button less obnoxious and maybe make these things more streamlined instead of kind of wasting time tweaking very many variations that maybe are a small delta.
No, thank you for sharing all that insight when it comes to kind of user understanding as well as your experience in some of these areas. Let's switch gears and actually talk execution now. Execution is something I love, so I'm excited to kind of dive into this section. So, what are some of the key risks and challenges that come with executing on a 0 to 1 product? And what is your advice when it comes to mitigating some of these?
Yeah, some things I've seen in this space, I would say one is really around alignment. And there's an example, I believe it was Jeffrey Snover. He used to be a distinguished engineer at Microsoft. I forget where he went to now. I think this came from Bill or somebody, but the idea is basically called like the crayon test. And so it's effective this idea that, especially as you have teams that you're trying to make sure they're moving pretty quickly, can be autonomous, a little bit decentralized. How do you ensure that every decision everybody makes is generally aligned with the direction? And so there's this idea called the crayon test, which is that the litmus test is you should be able to walk up to anybody in the team, ask what we're doing or what problem we're trying to solve, or who the customer is. Pick your favorite question. And with a crayon, we should largely draw the same diagram. And so it's a crayon because it's a little bit fuzzy. It's not a pencil or something that's more perfect, because if it's perfect, then it would be a hive mind, which would be a whole very interesting thing to achieve. But really a crayon because it's a little bit fuzzy. But the idea being, again, generally we should make decisions and optimizations and trade-offs that are generally aligned with that direction. And so I think one is just really ensuring that, before you start and as you kick off, you spend a lot of time. Sometimes it might feel like a little bit too much time, really getting aligned and ensuring people are bought in, and not just at the surface level, but really we also understand the implications of what it means. One lesson for me was learning that I was in a meeting and I felt like I was advocating for potentially different storage choices for like this other experience we're building, and like how do we store the data, how do we model the data in the back end. And I kept feeling like the conversation was falling on deaf ears. I felt like people kept disagreeing, and not disagreeing in that like that idea isn't viable, but more like, why would we even try that? And I think in a moment of like a little bit of reflection, it occurred to me that it hadn't clicked that as part of like doing this effort, we have latitude to basically reinterrogate like all assumptions and how you'd ever build, any experience like this. And the company, like, we could do things different. Like, that's the whole point. And so it sort of took me a second in that moment to realize, okay, the thing people are debating is actually not the merits of any of other storage models. The thing they're debating is like, why are you trying to do a different storage model when there's like the thing we always use? And so now having to like kind of rewind and go, wait a minute, we're on something in the explore stage. We're on 0 to 1. Part of what we're doing is product in terms of how we could build that. By the way, that also includes, how we store things, how we model things in database. Like there could be things we come out with that in general, most other teams that are like in extract or some other stages don't get to do, but we get to do. And so sort of like going back to that, kind of realigning everybody and then moving forward again, such that again, we are drawing a similar diagram with our crayons. When I now bring up a question like, hey, what about this storage model or this? People understand intrinsically where that question is coming from. So just in general, alignment's one. I think the other one is really around like knowing when to leverage versus build. There's a common pattern you'll see, especially if you're in a larger corporate environment, where it's like, oh, there's this thing for that thing, and there's this thing for that thing, and there's this thing for that thing. And so that's kind of one part of it. But there's also this thing of like, okay, we're starting something new, and I want to own every single part of it. And I just want to write and build the system myself and like know everything. And I don't want to deal with that slow thing or this thing that has many approvals, so on and so forth. And so a lot of those things, kind of at odds and have a lot of tension. And so really thinking about how do you get creative in terms of, I would argue, the unique value prop or the thing you're innovating in typically is like a small sliver. And that's a place where you say, hey, let's push, let's ensure like we're spending a lot of time investing in that space, developing that space, evolving in that space. But in general, there are a lot of other components of that thing. Again, we talked about time zones, storage is a good example. There are a bunch of other things where it's like, yes, we could build our own, but like, what's the value in there? And really almost doing this to the point where it's painful, where like it's really starting to make no sense why you're like leveraging some of these other things. But you're trying to prove out again a particular value that you're going to add, this net new thing that doesn't exist today or hasn't been given the space to exist that your team can go push on. And so really just starting to like push on that to the point where it's almost ridiculous. And then you can say, all right, this part is unique. Again, that part typically will align to your charter. But in that way, it allows your team to kind of focus on like, what is our net new value we're adding? What is that problem we're solving? And that thing we're adding that doesn't exist. So that's another one I've seen. Potentially the last one I'll just share in there is there's this implicit assumption we don't talk about, but again, another mental trap that happens sometimes where the assumption is that evolution is linear. And so we started with this thing. Maybe like we started with like a note taking app, that is good with tasks, and we just start there and we just stay in whatever version. Maybe it's about like tasks and reminders. Maybe we change the name, but in general, like we just keep circling around this concept. Maybe it has like a particular view, and you just kind of stay in that. You're iterating, you're doing things. And I think there's this thing, I tried to push and had to learn the hard way of sometimes the dilemma you run into is that the frame you pick basically excludes all other ideas or solutions. So even if you're iterating and doing all these things and you're being creative in that space, you sort of exclude any other potential representation. So what if it's like tasks with notes in them instead? What if it's just about long prose instead, and that actually like represents both? Like there are a couple of ways you can start representing this that those models can't fit together. And so in one team that I worked on, we kind of had this idea of like, we call them rounds. So you sort of think about it like, video games where each level is like a different stage, and you sort of have these rounds where you're fighting sort of different battles. So like the characters are the same sort of, but the world building is different in each one. The kind of level ups and resources are different in each one, but also the outcome is different. There might be side quests, there might be other things in one that are not in the other. And so I sort of employed that model where as you start to identify, hey, like there's this idea or solution we think could be a solution in this space, you start building that out. Over time, more ideas will come and you start to realize, what if we group these in a different frame? And that now creates a different round. And then you start to get another, like maybe we group these. And you sort of start to have these parallel rounds where you can sort of explore kind of a hypothesis or some kind of foundational idea as a group. And you don't have to compromise because, well, we've decided that we're really going to just focus on like note taking first and this. We can't really include blah, blah, blah. No, you can because you have a different round. And so you start to do that. And this might mean you have like 2 or 3 rounds going at a time, which by the way means probably hopefully have good experimentation or iteration or platforms like this. But in doing that, you sort of give the team a little bit more agency to like, even with the solution, get a little bit more creative. And by the way, these rounds might end at certain points. You might get to the customers and realize there's something valuable here. You might also realize, hey, the concept of how we do organization in this one round with the concept of how we do storage in this other one, we should combine them. And so that allows you to like explore those things independently and combine them. And so that's another thing I found to kind of really help ensure that like we're really going broad as we can in the space, giving each idea the best possible chance of success, and then kind of combining or recombining, remixing, and seeing where some of these things go, and not getting trapped sometimes in this like linear model where you might not even realize you're in it, and start proactively rejecting or accepting things just because of that frame you're stuck with.
I love that you said that. Right,
Yep.
I know John has the next question, but I just want to double click on one thing you said. I mean, that like organizational momentum and kind of like the way we've always done it is one of the most difficult parts when you're like doing 0 to 1, especially if I've been in situations where the 0 to 1 team is like relatively small compared to the rest. And so you're just constantly fighting this battle of like everybody questioning, well, like, why would you want to do it that way? Or why would you need to do it that way? But I love what you said about like recognizing that and almost using it, right? This concept of these rounds, because I never thought of it like that, but you're right. It's kind of like that was the battle I was fighting. It's like I wasn't able to catch that. Oh, they were actually stuck in this one round, and I'm here trying to do something different, but like fit into their logic rather than just say, no, look, this is actually a separate thing, and there's a reason for that. No, I love they said that. I think we're gonna have to like go through in the notes and really like try to break out. You dropped a lot of gems there, but yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Ayuba. As a product manager, your skill set can vary based on what role you're doing, right? Like a platform product manager can have a very different skill set than a 0 to 1 product manager. So I'm curious, like, what are some of the most crucial skills or mindset that you think a product manager should have if they're working on 0 to 1 product initiatives?
Yeah, in my experience, I'll share a couple that have helped. In some of it, again, kind of look at Ken's framework and see kind of what makes sense. But some things I think that have helped me in general, like one, really thinking about like how do you keep the flow of information going. My current manager actually talks about this a lot, but I think in general, as you think of the learning velocity, but also what are all the questions we're figuring out that we need to answer. And so there's this notion of like, you could either run away from ambiguity or towards it. And so you sort of want to like keep going towards it and starting to understand, hey, what are the things that, questions that we're asking? We may not have the answer today, we may not have the answer tomorrow, but like, how do we start documenting those? And also like, when we have answers to those, how are we making sure we're sharing that, right? Back to, again, people are trying to think about like, why are we here? I think that team has been struggling with XYZ and not knowing that actually, no, they have an update. Actually, they just did this thing and they just learned that thing. And so really keeping that flow of information going, because it starts to show how the thinking is evolving, starts to spark ideas for other people. But also there's something to be said for like momentum and progress and people just feeling like the pace is going. And that generally like galvanizes other people when they feel like something's making progress. They're not stuck. It's about psychology, but also part like push on the team as well to ensure you're continuing to learn, which ties back to earlier conversation about like how do you create things that are more rituals that are recurring, kind of force some of those things. I think the second thing to think about is, how do you ensure that there's a clear like frame for like the why or the keeper of like the general reasons why we're going after what we're going after. It's really easy to get disillusioned when you're doing some of these things, whether it's feedback you hear from somewhere, or you go to some review and then somebody says something that might be hard to hear, or a customer you thought was very excited one day decides they're not excited for whatever reason, or people that were engaged for a churn. Like there's so many things in this journey, which by the way also includes like this might not work out despite best efforts. And so a lot of times it's very easy for people to pile on where something's not going well. People are like, well, there's that thing and there's this thing and there's that thing. Because humans, right? Ambiguity is a tough thing to carry. And if there's any forum for that to fester, people like pile onto that. And so really being, someone who people can count on, and you also want to make sure this is shared, that you carry that why it's clear. There's both like a physical artifact, it could be a video, it could be a document, it could be slides, whatever medium works best. It could be a Slack post, and there'll be multiple. But you want to make sure like that why is really clear and people can point back to it and you always time back to it. Because over time, what you want to happen is more people to internalize over time in the team, those sets of reasons why we're going after what we're going, the framing, so on and so forth. And ideally, they are now repeating this back to others who are having the same question, but also now using that to make similar trade-offs in there. David Hong at what is it? He's at Replit now. He's the design and operations partner, if I got that right. Previously, he was the director of design at Webflow. He has this tweet that is very real to me, where he basically just says like, leadership role expectations, 24/7 thought leadership, conference speaking, and podcast interviews. And then it goes actual leadership role reality, saying the same thing over and over and over again consistently at scale, asking two teams if they've talked to each other, finding where that Google Doc is. And that's one of the realest tweets to me personally. Like I refer to that a lot and send it to a lot of people. But I also think it kind of captures the spirit of what I'm describing of like constantly saying the same thing at scale and ensuring other people are enabled with it, making sure there are artifacts people can point to and refer to so that they themselves can be enabled, and ensuring the right conversations are happening. The last one maybe to think about is really around, how do you flex and how do you jump in? And so there could be an argument made, and you see this sometimes where it's, this discipline doesn't exist, or this particular person is overwhelmed, or X is not my job, or Y is not my job, or B is not, my job. And I think just this idea of like, we're all a group of people that effectively model like the coalition of the willing. And we've been tasked with something that there isn't a clear answer to. And how do we go figure that out? So that might mean some days, in absence of anybody else, I'm going to go talk to the business development person because that's what needs to happen. It might also mean, somebody who might consider themselves an engineer in the team, primarily spends time writing code, might have to build, some system that allows us to connect customer feedback, and maybe even the best person to do the analysis, right? So on and so forth. And so this idea of like, how do you flex and jump in where it makes sense? Especially people have little superpowers hidden here and there that you can start to leverage. I've seen people say, hey, I'm getting overwhelmed at this, and this person has this other skill at organizing something, or something that would be considered classified as some other domain or discipline. It's like, oh, you ran a business before and you did the marketing for it. Do you want to help us, look at marketing copy and maybe help us with positioning, for example? And so I think this idea of like breaking down those silos starts to allow a lot of like really tiny teams have a lot of leverage, because now you're really like combining the collective skills and starting to amplify those things across the board. And not getting bogged down again with like what historically, as you start getting more expanding and more extracting, things get more formalized, for good reason. Things get more standardized, which is okay. But as you're like still like just getting started, like really being able to flex and jump in and get creative ideas from whomever is another really key thing you want to make sure you're modeling, but also ensuring like other people in the team feel empowered, kind of contribute to, and how kind of help shape, whatever that model is at the end of the day.
Awesome. Love that. So this has been a great conversation. As we mentioned in the beginning, we're going to jump to one of the questions we got from our product management mastermind community. So again, we have a PM mastermind community on LinkedIn. I think we recently crossed about 12,000 members. So very vibrant community, but we did ask them if they had any questions for you. And one of the ones that came in, we want to share. You've had a lot of conversations about different 0 to 1 efforts you've done. what would you say is the most
Yeah.
valuable lesson learned, in your experience working on these sort of like, startup explore phase type of products?
Two things come to mind for me. Generally, most people who know me and most of my core friends will get tired of me saying, the game is the game, and half the game is knowing which game you're playing. And so I think really being clear, not just about the stage you're in, but also as the stage evolves, what adjustments do you need to make? Again, the other framing, you'll hear is, what got you here won't get you there. Choose your favorite flavor. But just really, again, something that's caught me off guard multiple times where like the game has changed and you're still trying to play the old game and the rules don't apply. So I think that's kind of one side. And then the other side that goes hand in hand is really that mindset, and ensuring not just you, but everybody on the team you're working with embodies the mindset, understands like what it takes and what we're doing, and is making again those right set of trade-offs. There's so many when you just think about how many decisions get made on a team, both micro and macro, and think about if we're not aligned, what other things start to become suboptimal that you may never find out till it's too late, and then you'll now have extreme growing pains, especially if you start getting to expand or hypergrowth. Really just ensuring that like you're operating as one voice. One of the best working situations I had was the different incubation that I worked on. Myself and the engineering director, we'd both argue you could basically replace either of us in any meeting, and likely you would, I'd say 80% of the time, we would come to the same conclusion. And it's not that we agreed with each other, we parted what you just said, but we had spent so much time just co-working together and kind of building mental models for like, okay, the teamers we're leading and supporting, what are they about? What's the challenge we're working on? Constantly just iterating on like how we pitch this, constantly both pitching it together. And back to like being able to flex. At some point, it became a bottleneck where like you couldn't get the two of us into a meeting, and so we split up. And so sometimes it meant, he would go to meetings that you would consider classically like product meetings or partnership meetings or whatever. But I trusted like he could go support and lead in those meetings. And other times too, I would go to, some back end meetings, other things that would be considered architecture and engineering meetings. But he trusted like I knew enough of the system and I could also represent our teams very well. And so that worked, incredibly well. We would always debrief together at the end of the day. A couple of times we would have said different things, but in the end, like it was a healthy relationship, foundationally with trust. But again, like we shared enough of a mind meld that we trusted, like, all right, we're holding those whys pretty consistently. And like now we trust different team members even to go out, and do what needs to happen and kind of come back and like have a recap and a conclusion. So ultimately, I always just kind of look out for those things, at the end of the day of just one, kind of what stage, what's the game we're playing, being incredibly clear on that. What does that mean as well? What are the trade offs? And then on the other side, really just ensuring the people like we're going on this journey with are also like understanding, like, okay, this is the ride we signed up for. These are the implications. And then as long as we have a good, healthy rhythm on that, then I can start to trust more, delegate more, scale more through everybody else within the team, ensuring that we kind of like hit the target mostly, right, for the target we're going after.
I love that. I'm going through right now kind of this exercise where I'm realizing I'm working on this new thing and I can't be in every
Yeah.
meeting. I can't show up to all of the things, right? And so I do need to find those allies where we sort of are building this like shared understanding. So I love that. All right. Well, look, I think you've shared a lot of great insights. This is a great conversation. We're going to end with a rapid fire fun round. So
Okay.
yeah, let's just jump in. So first one is read versus watch. So TV/movie.
They
Oh,
clone
okay.
Tyrone. It's on Netflix.
All right, all right. That's on the list. I
Yeah,
haven't
yeah.
checked it out yet. Okay, beach versus mountains.
Beach.
Okay,
Get some
last beach
sun.
you recommend?
It's a beach out here in Washington and Seattle. It's called Haller Lake Beach. It's a really nice private beach, but it has like a public entrance, which is really cool. Fun fact is, I called it Holler Beach for the first time, and I still call it Holla Beach. What the people told me because Holla Holla is just easier to remember. But anyway, that would be my beach
All right, nice. So Seattle Beach. We haven't gotten one of those yet. That's good. Okay, last time you used generative AI tech and for what?
today, a few hours before this meeting. And I've been using it in general as what I call like a great sparring and thought partner. And so I've been using it everything from I'm trying to name this feature, and it was great. It's actually an update we made on one of the features I worked on. Came up with some pretty good suggestions, and that actually became the name. Recently, we made an update, and so doing that right now, I'm working on naming a feature, how do we talk about it, how do we position it, and some of those things, and then like what are the implications of that in like a larger set of features, and how do we think of that in the space. And so it's just been amazing just going back and forth, having a thought partner where again I can give a bunch of context about certain things and then start to play the okay, well, like what if it was more marketing oriented? Okay, what if you wanted to target this to users? What if you want to target this to like elder majority? What about talk to me like I'm five? Okay, how do you say that in like 5 words, 2 words? Okay, give me 7 examples now, but like with this consideration. And so I think it's just been incredible for me, at least as a product person, just to accelerate a lot of things that maybe I'd have had to find a larger brain trust, do more scheduling, which I'm still going to do. But now, like, I'm seeding with 10 really good ideas as opposed to like maybe 2 or 3, which most people gravitate towards, and then maybe sort of get the 1 or 2 differentiated ones. So now I'm getting 10 to 15 or even 20 like really solid ideas with like a bunch of thoughts already written out. Obviously, some light editing here and there, but in terms of like accelerating and amplifying my capability, it's been a lot of fun to leverage those.
Akshay is our resident Gen AI expert. She uses it for everything. I definitely have tapped into the naming one. I think for me, it's about like projects and work streams. I just absolutely can't
Yeah,
stand doing that, naming them. So yeah, Gen AI has been
yeah.
absolutely critical for that.
It, it's very creative. I've recently been spending more time with like prompt tuning because I feel like the first answer
Hmm.
always sounds good enough, but then you're like, "Ooh, what if I just ask it add a little bit more?" Be like, "Oh, can you be a little bit more cheeky with your response? Can you be a little bit more, I don't know, concise?" And it actually does a better job. I think it like sucks with
Hmm.
numbers, but concise brevity, like it understands those words a lot better. So yeah.
Yeah, I've even found like sometimes to like I'll ask for options and then I'll say, okay, I like option 3, 4, and 5. Use those as the foundation and give me 10 new
Yes.
options, and then it goes
Yeah.
from there. Then add the hey, make those concise, and then the explain it to me like I'm five on top of that, and I find I get really lovely
Totally
examples.
agree with the whole like, hey, give me options like this, but not the exact same. Yeah. Do that all the time.
Nice. We're getting the pro tips here. Love it. All right. Last one. What's your favorite product right now, and why?
Current favorite product is actually the product I'm talking to you over. It's a product called Arc. It's a browser from a startup called the Browser Company in New York. And I think there's this framing you've probably heard around. Most companies ship 2 products. One is the product as we like to think of it, and the other is their culture. And I feel they're probably one of the most stunning examples right now in the industry of both shipping a culture and a product, and both that push the values really around like better being possible, different being possible, software that really allows you to feel something and have feelings, which the entire setup process actually had me in my feels, which is incredible. But also on their culture front, right, where things like how they talk about people that use their product as members. They have a whole membership team, for example, which covers everything from people to feedback, so on and so on. They have a storytelling lead, for example, which handles what would be considered PR or marketing and just messaging and some of those things. And they like drive all of that, but really from like a storytelling perspective. So even how they name the roles in the startup, really instructive, really insightful. Their founder, Josh Miller, had a pretty awesome deep dive and podcast on Lenny's pod as well. So that might be a good one for people to tap into. But again, in general, I would just say, again, just stunning example of just like what it means to really like build a culture in public too, by the way, in addition, build a product with a lot of the product ethos that I think a lot of us aspire to.
Yeah, quick plus one to Arc. They just recently made it out of beta, so now anybody can download it. It's been fun. I still feel like I use Chrome or Safari a little bit more, but the way that they think about browsers is very different. It's refreshing. Let me put it that way.
Yep. And I'm excited too for like their grander vision around. I know they've had conversation on like also like the internet computer and like how do you think of using the internet becomes a really interesting concept. So anyway, just energized to your point just by a lot of the things they're pushing. And I don't think they by any means claim to like know it all or even preach any of or a lot of these things will work. But I think just that ethos and sharing. I think recently Zoo they just shared. They have an engineer on their team who all they do is just prototype, And a lot of those prototypes never see the light of day. But again, back to like learning velocity and some things we talked about, just the idea that a lot of ideas get to be prototyped and then people can actually feel them and see what it really feels like to use this day to day. And maybe some will see the light of day, maybe some won't. But in addition to customer feedback, kind of where do they end up as like product crafters? Just really energizing for me to see. Yeah, check it
That's
out if you
awesome.
haven't
I've heard a
already.
lot about it. I definitely do want to check it out. So let's just wrap up here. This was a phenomenal conversation. Let's close out. Again, we have a lot of notes here. We'll like include some links. But where can people find you? How can they connect with you? Anything else you want to share as kind of like closing thoughts?
Yeah, finding me, you can find me on LinkedIn, just with my name would probably be in the notes, or you can find me on Twitter or X, whichever one you decide to use, just like my first initial, so AAUDU. And yeah, I just want to say thank you to the team. Thank you, Felix. I mean, thank you to everybody here. I mean, it's been wild seeing this grow. 12,000. I mean, that's an incredible number. And I'm also just excited to see what things resonate with people, what other things people have learned. Love to continue the discussion. But overall, just thank you for having me. I really
Our
appreciate it.
pleasure, man. You dropped some gems. So yeah, we'll definitely include all those links in the notes so people can find you, and we'll let you know when this episode comes out. But with that, this has been another great conversation with the Product Management Mastermind, a community for PMs to get advice, share advice, and build relationships. We'll see y'all next time. Have a good one. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Product Management Mastermind on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcasting platform. And remember to leave us a rating and review so that we can reach more listeners. We appreciate your support.